This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joe Marion. Welcome to the Cloud Communications Alliance webinar. More specifically, welcome to the European conversation. The Cloud Communications Alliance has decided for the next 3 months, we're going to have some webinars that are focused on European-centric issues. Today's, we're going to talk about platform providers. In December, we're going to talk about the future of the channel in the EU. And then in January, we're going to talk about EU regulatory updates for 2022. But today's session, again, is about creating value with a platform provider. We'll introduce our guests in just a moment. In November, we're going to have a US-focused webinar having to do with the COVID mandates in the US, as well as 911 compliance. So those are more US-focused, and those will be in November. You'll hear more about those through email and through other means. We have you've been on many of our webinars already. You all are probably all too familiar with the buttons, the mute button, the camera on and off. You all know how to use them. So feel free, if you have something to say, you can unmute yourself. We're gonna have some time for questions and answers at the end of this webinar, but if something's very pressing and you want to, in the middle of it, feel free to unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and ask the question. Next. Great. Now let me turn over to Patrick. Patrick's our host from Cavell. Patrick, take it away.
Thanks, Joe. As Joe was saying, this is European focus, so I get as the British representative, if you can call Britain in Europe any longer. That's a whole can of worms. We don't need to open up. But my pleasure to moderate the webinar today. And as Joe said, we're going to be focusing on creating value with a platform provider with a real lens focused on the European market. And the CCA, with their fantastic selection of connections, has managed to rustle up a really good panel today with some of the biggest service platform providers that cover the European market. So first of all, I've got Chris Parker, Chief Platform and Innovation Officer at Destiny. How are you, Chris?
Doing well, Patrick. Very happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us. We're also joined by Bertrand Porcelot, Head of International Sales at Marketing from enreach. How are you, Bertrand?
Yep, very well, thank you. Hi, everyone.
Good to have you aboard. And Yves Desmet from RingCentral, Head of Service Providers, VP for Service Providers for RingCentral. How are you doing, Yves?
Great, excellent. Thank you very much. I hope I can stay on because I'm probably one of the few ones traveling. So I'm doing this on a mobile data roaming connection. So if it's a little bit choppy, you know why, but very pleased to be here.
Sounds good at the moment. I'm not familiar with this traveling thing you speak of, though. I very rarely leave my living room at the moment. I've been isolated in the living room for quite a long time. And last but definitely not least, we've got Marcel Cardol, Director for Service Providers and Partner Collaboration for the EMEA at Cisco. Marcel, how are you doing?
Hi, Patrick. I'm fine, thank you. Good to be here.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining me. We've got a really packed session. As Joe was saying before, I scheduled a bit of time at the end of the session. We'll run to the top of the hour for Q&A. But if anyone has anything pressing, you've got their chat functionality. You can unmute yourselves, let your videos know, and feel free to interrupt us with anything pressing. If not, we've got sort of 10 minutes at the end. So I wanted to start with probably the most sort of obvious question from a sort of foundation point of view if you're a cloud communication service provider, and that's how you might determine the sort of initial criteria that you might evaluate a communications platform provider on, if that's not too wide a question. Because I don't think it's a case of just going out there and looking at individual vendors. You probably have to define a selection of criteria, first of all, maybe open platform, that sort of thing. So I was interested to get the thoughts of all of you panelists. And Bertrand, why don't we start with you on that? What sort of criteria are your service providers looking for?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, for this question. Maybe first of all, I would start saying that there is not like one service provider. There is a variety of service providers, from the historical carriers, I would say, the mobile players, the MNOs, and all the new service providers, new entrants coming from some verticals, or formerly resellers becoming service providers. So there's a big variety of service provider, and I believe that the criteria are very much depending on when they are in their journey towards being a service provider and which type of services they want to focus on. Being a UC specialist or being a more global managed service provider with a very broad portfolio. But I can still name a few criteria that when talking to service providers they bring up. First of all, is our future proof? Is the platform? Is it evolutive? Is it open standard based? Very key item. Also questions around how it will integrate into the BSS and OSS of the service provider. What's the time to market? What's the time to revenues? That's the second types of criteria really come across very often. And how it allows to create, I would say, customization and more value by integrating with whether it is with CRM systems or with some vertical integration. These are examples of criteria. Of course, platform stability, high availability, redundancy are key as well, but they are assumed as granted by the service provider in general. So also more and more a lot of questions about, is it mobile first? The world is going mobile. Do you bring FMC and full mobility? And maybe a last one is about the user experience. I'm very much focused on the user experience. Is it simple to use? Are there self-care solutions? These would be the main criteria I would list on which we hear in the field. But happy to hear also my colleagues here opinions on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think there's interesting. And you talked about some things that would be considered sort of table stakes, the reliability, the redundancy options of the platform. But there are those sort of more expansive criteria or capabilities that you might expect. And Chris, if we go to you next, would you agree with that it very much depends on the initial requirements of the service provider in terms of what background they might have come from, or whether they specialize in a particular vertical, what their particular area of focus is?
Well, I think Bertrand's answers were spot on as a practical checklist. And what I was reflecting when he was speaking was maybe to take a different perspective on that and come back to the service providers. What is the experience they're going to try to create or co-create with their customers and end users, not only now but in the future? And that may be a little bit of a challenging thing, because if you select a platform based on features of today or integratability for today, things I would add to Bertrand's already excellent list is what is the customer experience that service provider really wants to differentiate themselves in the market, and how do they want to be different as far as maybe a low-cost leader or a highly customizable provider. And those are different, depends on their target market as well, if they're going to focus mainly on the micro market or whole spread of the market. And one thing I would add when I'm involved in selection processes in the past as a buyer, but also as an advisor and talking to our service providers, is not only where is the service provider partner now, but where are they going? And this can be a very subjective thing, but what's the cultural fit? Because you have some wonderful providers in the market here, represented here today. And what's the cultural fit in order to innovate forward? So not only what are you getting now out of the box, so to speak, but how are you going to co-create that as a community around that provider and around yourself moving forward?
Yeah, really interesting. And Eve, from a RingCentral perspective, I assume that all of those things factor into the decisions from your service providers when they're talking to you about potentially selecting RingCentral.
Exactly right. So of course there was this whole technical list, and something that's really popping up certainly since July ruling, right, is really data privacy security, right? So certainly if you have a cloud platform, how do you enable service providers to actually be compliant in the different countries? If they are multi-regional, how can actually, for example, if you have let's say somebody who's active in the UK and in Germany, there's sometimes conflicting privacy requirements, right? How do you actually make that work within their risk profiles, right? So certainly security privacy is a very hot topic lately, the last couple of months, right?
And just as Eve predicted, sorry, we lost you for a second there.
Sorry, I'm not sure where you lost me, but indeed, so security and privacy is really hot topic amongst what we see as service provider partners. Then indeed, it's not only the feature set today, but indeed the ability to innovate, right? So how much money is your platform provider on an ongoing basis, putting in R&D and evolving the platform, right? It's fine to have the features today. We all know that this industry moves at an extraordinary pace, right? What's going to happen in 2, 3, 5 years, right? So how much dollars or euros is the platform provider being able to constantly throw into that development, right? But also, a lot of the features was actually UC based. As we see more and more buying decisions of the end customer is UC plus CC, right? So how can you marry that? How do you have platform providers offer the best of both worlds? And then, as indeed, I think Bertrand, but it's actually the commercial model, right? How do you marry then the commercial model of the service provider with the commercial model of the platform, right? How much investment can a platform provider do in go to market and marketing resources and sales resources, right? So I'm not sure it's only technical now, but there's also as much commercial and go to market investment that you have to do as a partner.
Yeah, that technical development piece in terms of R&D spend is important, because I mean, I've been following Microsoft Ignite this week. Obviously, everyone is competing and partnering with Microsoft on some level, and their annual spend on R&D, I think, is about $19 billion. So that is quite a sizable thing to compete with, that R&D spend. Marcel, from a Cisco perspective, I wanted to hear your thoughts on it as well, but I also wanted to hear the Cisco thought in terms of the different types of deployment model as well, which is factoring into service providers a lot more, because we talk a lot about the cloud, but that isn't necessarily the only route that service providers can consider.
No, correct, Patrick. From a Cisco perspective, we have a legacy, still a big legacy in premise deployments, and that comes down to public sector, tough markets to reach, like the Middle East, where regulation and data sovereignty are even more strict as in the EU. I'm talking about my scope as EMEA, and I have to convince my US colleagues on a day-to-day basis that in Europe or in EMEA we have 131 individual markets that we try to address. We do premise-based deployments. We do partner-hosted, of course, with HCS and our former, basically our BroadSoft acquisition that we did. And we have now also cloud options available. So for us, the criteria to go left or right or in the middle is more about, what is the compliance that a service provider can add to our platform to make it suitable for a market as Turkey or Saudi Arabia or the UAE or even Germany. And in some cases, it's a tough conversation. In other cases, we see a complete transition to the cloud, like in the UK and in the Benelux. But we have basically all these options available, and there's some FUD in the market that we moved away from prem or partner hosted. That was just a licensing model. The licensing model went to subscription, like everybody's moving to SaaS and OpEx. That's not different for Cisco.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to move on a little bit. One of the things that, and Cavell, we talked to lots of service providers, and I think a discussion that was had potentially a lot more 5 years ago was whether you build or buy or partner. And I think the partner option, as today, talking to platform providers, has become a lot more prevalent. Are you still having discussions with service providers who are considering building their own platforms, or is it much more looking either to buy a platform or partner and white label solution? And Marcel, you can come back in on that from the Cisco point.
Yeah, sorry, I was nodding heavily because we signed up a new service provider today, which was not even on the radar from a high touch perspective, but they were imminent or adamant that they would like to host and own the platform. That decision comes with, what is your route into scalability? How many users are you going to ramp up, and also what you're going to do with the platform? Is it should be more than hello, right? It is also, I think if you mentioned it, it's also the additional workloads around unified communications, contact center, and selling into the hybrid work premise with devices, etc. So yeah, on a day-to-day basis, we still see partners that are willing to make that investment in the platform and integrate it into their OSS, BSS and compliant to the regulatory situation. So it's not ruled out; it still happens, and we will happily take them as well.
And Chris, you and I were discussing when we were doing sort of the planning call for this, that it's not as black and white as sort of build your own or partner, there's a level of sort of collaborative development required between service providers and platform partners, and I know that's something that you've thought about a lot.
Yeah, well, first I'd agree with Marcel that it's very, certainly in Europe, contextual. So not only the geography, but the industry. And I would also even say the maturity of the service provider and where they're going. What they see as strategic or a strategic enabler. And I think buy before build is a few dimensions, but there's a reuse dimension, a reuse before refactor, before buy, before build, before partner. And these are sort of maybe a sort of a hierarchy of decisions that you could make or reflect on. The thing I would add in is scope, meaning what is it that they're looking to buy or consume as a service, because it could already, even from the end user apps and how, if you're going to buy that from a service provider, how do you co-create that simplified branded experience for the service provider at that really edge, where, for me, where the actual value is actually created, when a user is being more productive or more happy on their day, that's where the value is created. And then, through the chain back to this, the platform providers, where you can capture some value and share that along the way. So it's a question of scope as well. So, if it's the UC or the CC space, and if that's sort of the core, and then if the service provider is going to build around that, or if you're going to have some sort of collaborative approach to configure or reuse some things during that whole chain. So it's not an obvious question, and it really has to do with where the service provider is coming from, and certainly where they're going with their ambitions, and are they able to scale and support that?
Yeah, that contextual point is key. But Tom, come in on that.
Yeah, maybe I think that I would see two main criteria. One is privacy and compliancy that we hear now and there. Okay, I need it hosted there for the data compliance or some regulatory compliance, and also for sometimes the control of the product lifecycle. Some of the service provider, at least they believe, they have a better control on the product lifecycle for their own experience if they host it themselves. And also a number of MNOs still, when you want to deliver full FMC on the core mobile integration, can be reluctant to expose some of their core mobile network assets somehow to a platform integration. At least in some region, in some country, I believe it's also cultural. But we hear also two messages which are key. And it's not really, I believe, related to where it's hosted and whether it's a carrier hosted or a full SaaS, which is white labeling and my full branded approach supported, and does your offering depend on that, and also who owns the customer. So that's two key criteria that we are in the discussion: the customer ownership by the partner. And it doesn't directly relate to where it's hosted, but in the minds of some service providers, these four are combined: product lifecycle control, privacy compliancy, white labeling, branded approach, and customer ownership. I would list as some key factors.
And Yves, from the RingCentral side, obviously you've been growing incredibly fast in terms of channel and partners. Is the partners, service providers looking to build their own platform something that you've had to overcome to bring new partners? Do you still see that?
Less and less, right? A couple of years ago, and with my history, yes, it was, right, and that's really going away. I think if you look at an internal development, right, if that's your criteria of internal build, I think that's almost gone, right? Almost nobody can still fund their own internal development, right? Then you go with the issue: do I host or do I go for SaaS, right? But even there, I think all the criteria you just mentioned, like branding and so on, has nothing to do, right? That's a political choice, or maybe a almost a religion. Will I host it myself, or will I go to a SaaS platform? What's really important is indeed how can the service provider either defend their brand exposure, co-brand, or even push the brand of the platform provider, right? And again, there's a whole spectrum of choices out there. And the second one is indeed how can they differentiate if they want to differentiate, right? What's the co-creation, right? What's the ability to integrate, co-create, and create new developments so they can actually really deliver solutions targeted to their customers, right? And that's really what's important, right? How can they integrate? How can they use APIs? How can they co-create? But I think less and less the discussion is going, do I go for a cloud platform or host it myself, right? I think the majority of our customers categorically go for a completely cloud platform nowadays.
Yeah, that collaborative development piece is particularly interesting. I'm going to jump ahead slightly just because Bertrand triggered me on this and mentioning sort of regulatory and compliance requirements, and it was a question I had sort of further down my list, but particularly within Europe and specifically within certain countries within Europe, particularly Germany is the example that's always cited. Data sovereignty, data security, compliance, regulation are particularly important. So I was interested in how you as platform providers can help assist service providers in this area to ensure the sort of compliance. And is it more than just having local regional data centers? And if you don't mind, Marcel, I'll start with you. I'll start with the US sort of headquartered companies, because I think that's where it generally comes from a European perspective. But Marcel, go ahead.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, what you said is I have to come back to the location of the data centers. I mean, our friends in the US have completely understood that we need local data centers across Europe. That includes the UK, by the way. So, and you know, that is a train that is not stopping. So we have the data center in Germany, we have data centers in Paris and UK and the Netherlands. So that is an expanding thing. That comes back to facilitate predominantly the cloud option for service providers, where the service providers decide not to host their own infrastructure anymore, which is, by the way, a big trend, as Yves also indicated. But for everything that we put in hands of the service providers in terms of platform hosted, of course, then it becomes the responsibility of the service provider to be 100% compliant. So it is a sort of level play where the cloud option will put a lot of responsibilities in our shoes, and that comes back to where the data sits and is hosted and resides. If it's platform hosted, that responsibility shifts up to the service providers, and that is a thing that works in practice pretty well.
Yeah, of course, deployment model dependent. And Yves, do you want to come in on that? Because I'm assuming from a RingCentral perspective, you've had to go on a similar journey there in terms of setting things up for European compliance.
Fully, right? And again, also the European compliance, it's a moving target, right? Every couple of months, the legislation moves. There's new rulings, right? So it doesn't stop, right? It's a little bit like data security, right? Hackers always find new ways, right? The regulation will always change. But indeed, right? The trend is clearly European hosted as much as possible. And I make one caveat. If you look at UC, right, it's no longer just about core voice. If you look at the core voice switching, it's true, right? That's easily put, right? But then if you have some very advanced AI features, real-time translation, and you use third parties from all over the globe, right? We really have to look at this a little bit broader spectrum. So full data residency is probably very hard to achieve as a service provider, right? But indeed, it's moving there, and probably not only to data residency, but also control, right? For example, who has access to your data? Is it only European people, European support people? Is it supported by American people, right? So these are day-to-day conversations we have with our service providers. But at the end, it's really the service provider partner that has to decide on the risk profile he's wanting to take, right? We are very strict, right? But again, some service providers are extremely loose, are open to use third-party AI analysts, right, on top of the data. Others say, no, everything has to be hosted and very tightly controlled. But it's true, the trend is European data storage, European employees only accessing it, right, and very strict control. Unfortunately, that's where the market seems to go, correct.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a trend we've seen with the sort of giant data management companies, and you talked about the use of AI and data intelligence services. I think that's a trend we've seen more widely, is that sort of focus on Europe. Chris, from a more, and obviously Destiny European focus, from a more general perspective, how can you as a platform provider assist your service provider partners in terms of compliance and data security and all of those really fun, interesting topics?
Well, I find those fun and interesting. In my role at Destiny, being responsible for platform technology, I live in that regularly. At Destiny, we have a complementary view from what the peers have just mentioned, where data sovereignty, as we define it, really has to do with the data sovereignty of the individual, of the citizen, particularly driven by EU regulation. And what we also hear about from the service providers is national sovereignty. And I think data location has plays in both of those. What we find is and I agree with what was just mentioned as far as the risk profile, because it really comes down to the interpretations, because the laws and regulations can be unclear because they've been made by politicians and not very directive. And so then it's a question of finding that space of intimacy where the service provider advisors, their internal legal and procurement, are actually able to, and I hope service providers do with all their platform provider partners, and open their kimono a little bit, say, well, actually, this is what we see as regulation that we need to do, not only from a legal perspective, but also from a brand perspective and just a general data hygiene and wisdom perspective. This is the position we want to take on data sovereignty for the individual, and in some cases, national sovereignty for if they're really a core carrier and they're part of that national infrastructure and has even additional requirements. And I don't want to say co-create a solution for that, because they really need to own that, because this is they're wearing the risk, it's their brand, etc. If something happens, this is really going to be on the service provider as well as us as a provider to them. But how do we have that dialogue to find the logical, reasonable, and cost-efficient ways to abide by those requirements?
Yeah, that's it. And Bertrand, that is key, isn't it? There is a collaborative element between the service provider and the platform provider here, isn't there? It isn't one or the other. Everyone in totality is responsible, and particularly, as Chris was saying, in Europe, it's very much individual focused.
Yeah, I think it's a combination. There is the actual software on platform design by the let's say the vendor approach somehow, and then how it's implemented, hosted, whether it's in the carrier data center or in the public cloud. And this is this combination that really can create the right level of compliance. And at enreach, we deliver both models. So either a carrier DC hosted or a partner hosted deployment model, or a SaaS model, full SaaS model, and sometimes also an hybrid approach where core switching or some of the services are partner hosted and carrier hosted, and some others are delivered from the cloud. And I would really echo what Yves was stated, is that as UC and UC plus CC and also additional AI services are getting implemented and are becoming really the key value of the platform, it's more and more difficult to provide a fully partner-hosted model, and you will have at least an hybrid model, and you have a lot of cloud-to-cloud integration. So you'd better look at how you fully secure these cloud-to-cloud integrations, on how you fully secure whatever services around recording or all the data management capabilities to deliver it, I would say, from any location and through any cloud, to leverage also the power of the public cloud and the hyperscalers approach. I think that's very important.
Yeah, and that goes into wider areas in the network, I suppose, as well. One area that I did want to talk about, which comes up a lot when I have discussions with service providers at Cavell Group, is that customer ownership, the relationship of the customer. And I think that's been crucial for a lot of the most successful service providers and resellers in the past, is managing that customer relationship. And I want to know, obviously it depends slightly on the sort of go-to-market and deployment model that is taken up with the platform provider. But how do you as a platform provider go about sort of reassuring your partners that they are ultimately responsible for that customer ownership and that they manage the relationship? I've always thought that's quite a tricky, almost political area. So I was sort of keen to hear your thoughts on that. And Yves, from a RingCentral perspective, because I know you offer a number of different sort of options there, what you would think about that?
Yeah, I think it's for the service provider domain, it's really simple, right? As a platform provider, you have to give full control to the service provider, billing, customer care, sales motions, right? And the service provider owns that relationship. He knows it, because most often it's not just only UC they sell bandwidth, they sell mobile, they sell other services, right? So it's non-negotiable, right? And we wouldn't think about it. The service provider is owned typically by the service provider. Of course, the service provider says, look, let's work in an agency model, you own it, we're open to do that. But normally I would say even more than 99.999%, right? The service provider wants to and has to own that relationship, right? And it's key as a platform provider, you respect that. and basically you stand behind the service provider and delivering the best value to their customers, right? Because it's about the partnership, and the partnership model is that the service provider owns the customer. For us, it's non-negotiable. Yeah.
But Bertrand, what do you think about sort of customer ownership and from an enreach perspective?
Yeah, I think for, I would say, large carriers, it's a no-brainer. They want full control. But what we see also with tier 2 players on new entrants, they are very sensitive to owning the customers, as well as some of the large channel partners, because they're coming from being just plain resellers or dealers, growing and changing their model, and they really want to own the customer. They are very, very keen on that. And I can take some example in France where MNOs have bypassed their channels in the past, not to blame or accuse anybody there, but these lessons learned. So the channels are really reluctant to leave the customer ownership. So they really want to master the relationship to the end customer, and that also then sometimes adds to their appetite for the branding and having their own brand, because they think that's an additional protection, even if this one is a weak protection, to be honest. But that's a nice to have. That's a cherry on top of the cake, if I can say. But the customer ownership is really, really important. Besides that, I would say the flexibility to customize the bundles, which also sometimes is somehow related, or at least could be related, because that needs some BSS capabilities and the right integrations to control this bundle. So I believe customer ownership and these controls are key to differentiate, not only at technical level, but differentiate in your go-to-market and packaging and bundling approach.
Yeah, you're right. There's a number of different areas there outside of sort of contracts and on all of those things where that customer ownership can be ensured. Marcel, from Cisco's side, I know that obviously not just within communications, but across IT and networking, you know, that's been the partner ecosystem is sort of a core foundation of the Cisco proposition. So that customer ownership piece must have come up a lot.
Well, yeah, but on the other hand, it is not a topic. Traditionally, over 99% of our business is going indirect, so through the channel, and specifically for basically what we're talking about today. So everything related to UC and collaboration. I would say in Europe or in EMEA, let me take it a little bit broader. The service providers are responsible for over half of our revenue or bookings in the channel, and we don't care about the customer ownership. We are not geared and designed to support end customers anyway. So we are a partner-led organization, and we are looking into additional routes to market. That is not a secret, because there are trends that we cannot stop, like marketplaces and agency, but in many markets, many big markets in Europe, these service providers are key to the bulk of our bookings, because they dominate the SMB market. For instance, in France, you have 3 telcos, and if you work with them all, you own 70% of the SMB market, and that's not different in other markets. So customer ownership is not an issue, and not a story for Cisco.
And Chris, from the Destiny side.
Yeah, I for this, I think I'll take off my platform hat and I'll put on my service provider hat for a moment, if I can
You're allowed.
switch slides for a second. Because what we're seeing in the Destiny geographies where we have our own service providers is it really comes down to that channel. So I think I'm underlining a little bit what has already been said, but what the market is asking for, some of those resale partners, which is maybe a next level on the value chain as far as ownership. Some of them are asking for a pure white label solution, full wholesale solution that they can integrate, add other products on their own. And others are looking really for almost a turnkey thing that they can just resell, and then even look to us as Destiny to actually run the billing, and they don't have a problem with the branding because that's not their core business. So I think it comes down to really the context of the channel, and just to be very, very clear about it. What we are seeing, again, coming back to that technology stack through the whole value chain, is more questions of how can we support them on OSS, BSS, on billing, on portals, on apps, and provide that in more of a flexible and white label way, because they're finding that actually keeping up to speed with the market on their own is sort of wearing them out. And those are some of the, so it's not really about customer ownership, but more about experience ownership. So how can we provide underlying technology and they can own the experience, and therefore also the customer contact.
I wanted to move on to sort of differentiation within the market, because at Cavell we obviously track the number of service providers and platform providers and vendors, and ultimately the sort of communication platform provider options have been shrinking for a while within the industry. So you come to a place where a lot of service providers are going to be using the same underlying platform from different providers. And a couple of you have mentioned it, Bertrand, I know you mentioned customization and that sort of thing. So I'm keen to know how a service provider can differentiate themselves from other competitors who are effectively using the same underlying platform. And Chris, I know you mentioned sort of that individualistic development route, but I'm keen just to understand that differentiation piece. And Yves, you can start from the RingCentral side.
It's actually it's a real fun topic, and a couple of things that always go through my mind. I get this question not every day, but every other day, right? And my first answer is, be customer obsessed. Don't be competitive focused, right? Focus on your customers, right? That will solve itself. And if you look at it, a very mature market is the mobile market. How does one mobile service provider differentiate against another? It's not by technology. It's the same phone. They all sell iPhones, Samsung phones. They use the same network, right? They differentiate on how they market to the customer, how they own the customer, right? And then, of course, on top of that, in UCaaS, it has to look, how do you integrate your technology stacks, right? Your orchestrated experiences. If you do CRM integrations, integrations on contact centers, right? It's really about owning that customer experiences, right? And if you offer the right integrations or experience, right, customer stays about 2 times longer if you do that correctly, and generate about 4 times more the same value than if you don't focus on that, right? So really, it's about how do you orchestrate your technology stacks? How do you onboard the customers consistently, and really be obsessed with the quality of your customer and the experience of the customer? And for the rest, we are really getting to it's not a big differentiator eventually, right? If you look at voice, which more features can we differentiate on, right? It's really how do you manage your customer and how do you integrate the technology stacks for the better experience of your customer.
Yeah, I suppose that is true. The features and functions are sort of homogenizing, and it eventually, in a perfect world, will reach sort of a parallel. Chris, from a Destiny perspective, I know you talked about the sort of collaborative development and development paths that different providers take. What do you see in terms of a differentiation focus from Destiny partners?
Well, this might sound like an odd statement come from a head of technology, but what the drum that I beat regularly, in the halls of Destiny, is the technology creates no value at all. Unless an end user is actually able to have a more productive business life, and the end client is actually running their business in a more valuable or they're creating more valuable way, that is what the technology should be focused on. And what I would underline is actually it's the way that the service providers can differentiate competitively is their people. Because as you said, this the feature factory of the service providers are starting to come together, and so if you want to compete only on a the rat race of the next best feature, that's going to be exhausting. In some cases, maybe your own branded experience needs a specific feature, and then it maybe comes into a buy versus build question again of whether that you ask your service provider to do that, or you build something bespoke on your own, or solve that another way. What I would focus on is really the people, and what are the service providers' people able to do, either automated or directly. What are they really able to do with the platform? That's what I would focus on. And of course, that comes back to this co-creation, and you have to understand what they're trying to achieve in the market.
Yeah, that again, I suppose that in relation, come back to Yves' point in terms of that customer focus, know what area you're specifically going to create value in. But Bertrand, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I would really echo what has just been said, but emphasizing it to this end-to-end experience. But not, experience, sometimes you just think about the end user, but that's also the different enterprise roles in the organization. So their own experience, from onboarding to day-to-day experience, and including as well the resellers and the service providers. So in the whole value chain, this end-to-end experience, from subscription through onboarding to the day-to-day operations, and this customer focus, depending on who is your customer in this value chain, but at the end of the day, the end users are the customers. They are the one paying for the services. So what's in it for them and what's the value proposition for them? Still, I see a lot of differentiation around the integrations because in many areas you have a lot of silos. We mentioned the UCaaS and CCaaS silos, and we talk about converged contact technologies at enreach to merge these experiences, but also integration with CRM and verticals. We had a very interesting project where we had a custom integration with notary software or different, I would say, vertical softwares, where I would say there has been a shift. Before, telecom operators and carriers were somehow the kings, and maybe I will open some APIs for integration, but that's going to be challenging and so on. This has really changed very widely, and it's now the opposite. It's the vertical players saying, hey, dear telcos and service providers, if you don't bring in APIs and capabilities, I will just add some WebRTC components and embed them in my solution. So these two angles and these synergies and how you collaborate to create the nice experience, I think is very important, and it's all related to API, but also the simplicity. Very often we get too many features, too complex. And it's nice when you have a very feature rich, but sometimes it's quite complex to make things simple, if I can say.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back to that point that Chris was making about user adoption. That is constantly drummed in from a technology perspective. Marcel, from a Cisco partner differentiation perspective, would you agree with those points?
Oh yeah, lots of things have been said where I fully agree with. I just want to, from the Cisco perspective, if you think outside in, the differentiation that we see that is really important is, and I think one of the panelists already, other panelists mentioned this, customer lifecycle and stickiness is so much more extending with the workloads that a customer is adopting. So if you're stuck in the old, and that is calling, that is a declining market, enterprise voice market is declining. But if you overlay team messaging, web conferencing, contact center, and as you know, Cisco has the whole device portfolio that taps into hybrid working with personal video devices, but also room systems. That is a conversation you can have on enterprise level. But now, due to the pandemic, it's also a discussion that we have in SMB markets and mid-market. So that differentiation is brought to the market by the SPs because they add their network technology on top of it, security layer on top of this, and then it becomes a really interesting value proposition for the market where you can do everything that a employee needs to do, where you basically bring the power of the platform and the power of the SP together, and that's a differentiation that we see a lot in the market.
We're coming up to about quarter of an hour left of the webinar, and I can see we've had a couple of questions from the audience, so I want to get to those. I just wanted to do one final one first. And we talked right at the beginning of the conversation about sort of table stakes that a service provider might expect from their platform provider, and I was just interested to sort of talk about what those table stakes might be, and also take it one step further. What are those nice to haves if you're a service provider looking for a new communications platform partner? What might you look for? And Chris, I'll come to you first, because you were talking about user adoption. That made me think of, in my old technology world, of the amount of training that was required potentially for service providers on new systems. What do you think are sort of the table stakes in terms of quality to service requirements, and then also those nice to haves? Maybe it's additional sales training, marketing assistance, those sorts of things.
Well, as far as the basic table stakes, I think we've mentioned a lot of those already. As far as that checklist of requirements of selection, we also looked into, the culture, ability to invest, obviously the risk profile, the ability to support, the data and national sovereignty. So I think there's, we've covered a lot of that. I think what I would wish, if I was a service provider, looking at all of us as platform providers, what I would wish that maybe we all were better at is enabling them to sell more. So our platforms is our collateral, is our training, supporting them to sell more. Do we make their lives easier to sell? Do we make, do we make their lives easier for their end clients to migrate? Are we making their life easier for their end users with self-service? Or coming back, I'll repeat what Bertrand said as far as simplicity is hard, and being able to have that sort of grown-up conversation on what features are we not going to deliver in order to together have that conversation. What are we going to not do in order to simplify the experience? I think that's kind of a maturity in co-creating an experience together, even though it's branded by the service provider. We as platform providers are just mission critical enablers to that. And so this is some things that I would love to see over the horizon that maybe we all get better at.
Marcel, I'll come to you because I know firsthand from working in a Cisco partner in a previous life that Cisco focuses on a lot of those areas that we talked about. What would you see are the sort of real value adds that if you were a service provider you'd look for in a communications platform provider?
Well, I would definitely look into the partner profitability that a platform provider brings to the table. Interesting is that there's a lot of differentiation in market pricing across Europe even. So that is sometimes hard for a US resident company to address because they don't understand that there is a 50% delta between Southern Europe and Northern Europe, for instance. But partner profitability is key. The other one is where we really are focusing on is accelerating the go-to-market with market development funds and partner acceleration funds. So really putting money on the table to help our platform SPs to accelerate their business. So the last one I want to mention is, and that is where we sort of differentiate and also from homegrown solutions. In the WebEx platform, in the last 6 to 9 months, we have done 1,000 innovations that are really helping to allow our SPs to differentiate their offering, because some of these things are optional, some of these things can be switched on or off, and in the service creation process, it allows them to be really granular in how they position the service.
Bertrand, from an enreach perspective, what are you focusing on in terms of support ads for your customers?
I would say first that, and I think it was mentioned earlier, the cultural fit is key, and we tend to think that it goes together with proximity, being local, especially in Europe, even if it's Europe is there, but there are still some cultural differences and also landscape differences in terms of the channel structure, a lot of different price point as well as Marcel just mentioned. Also the shared vision, to me it's choosing a platform partner and a service provider platform partner is a bit like being ready for a joint journey. It's a bit like a wedding. You need to be ready for a joint journey. You don't really know everything from day one. So this cultural fit, this shared vision and some shared philosophy is key. But also there are still some very concrete checklists. Is the platform ready for automation? Is it flexible enough to adapt for my future challenges? I'm taking an old example sometimes, but if we would be 15 years earlier, and I would say here, what, Nokia will disappear as a terminal vendor, as a mobile handset vendor, while they were the #1 in the world, people would look at me saying, hey, this guy is under drugs, what's going on? So similar shifts may happen, and is my platform partner ready to cope with that? Is it open enough? Is it standard based enough? Is it maybe cloud native enough? Is it powered by microservices architecture? Can he combine different components to react, to adapt? And I think that's very important. Also, scale was mentioned. Scale in innovation while giving capabilities to differentiate. It's not easy because very often scale comes with uniformizing, with one size fits all sometimes. So these trade-offs are very key, big enough to matter, small enough to care, I would say, and ability to differentiate.
Yeah, absolutely. And Yves, I'll give you the sort of final work on this, because I know RingCentral have put a lot into your partner programs and incentives and encouragements to assist the partners.
Yeah. Of course, what just has been said, right? Those technology table stakes and microservice and all that, these are table stakes. This goes without saying, right? You have to have a good technology which is scalable and future proof, right? But it's much more than a technology integration in my head and a channel relationship, right? You're really building long-term strategic partnerships. And I know that word is sometimes overused, but if a service provider decides to put some services in your cloud, then you really are striking a strategic partnership with them, right? And it's not only about that, it's also how do you help them to sell, right? Because at the end of the day, the business model for cloud is if your service provider doesn't sell, you don't get revenues, right? So you have to enable the service provider, right? With your go-to-market sales book, right? Your experience you have from other regions, right? How do you enable them to sell? How do you make it easy? And that's probably what it boils down to as my closing remark, right? It has to be simple, flexible, and easy, both from an end customer, consumer adoption, but also for the salespeople, because the salespeople at the service provider, if it's too difficult to sell and the customers complain too much, they will not sell it, right? So it has to be easy for the customer, right? Easy to adopt and easy to use, but as easy to sell for the service provider.
Yeah, very good final concluding point. I want to thank all the panel. We've got a few minutes left, so we've got time for some audience questions. But I do want to thank all of the panelists, Steve from RingCentral, Bertrand from enreach, Chris from Destiny, and Marcel from Cisco for taking part. But we've got a couple of minutes left. I can see Ian and Clark. I know you're both on the line and you've submitted your questions. Would you like to ask them in voice, or would you like me to do an impression and voice those questions for you?
I'm prepared to speak for myself, but thank you for the offer. I sort of sat here and thought this question probably relates to our January webinar rather than this one, but it's just this feeling that the way we look at the access to data and the privacy stuff relates to, you know, this concept that data could be attacked and kept and taken away from us, and it needs to be protected. But if we're offering service 24/7, we might want to have access from around the globe so that our service teams can follow the sun. I didn't know if anybody had an opinion as to whether or not there might be some European review on the difference between access and location.
Let me chime in, because I actually this week had exactly that discussion with the service provider partner, right? And again, it's all about the risk profile, right? If you look at from a regulations point of view, there's probably no limitation for data leaving Europe or the country, and there's no limitation from external out of Europe resources accessing that, right? And we have a whole plethora of service providers, and some service providers indeed go as strict as saying you only will allow European and often only in-country resources to service my data. That means as a platform vendor, if you want that partnership with that service provider, you have to find a commercial model that works, where you offer 24/7 support from in the.
Oh, we've lost Steve there, just in the middle of a really good answer as well.
But I can well, until Eve is back, we have this experience as well with a number of mobile players, for example, that require from us support and access to any data, traces on the platform, whatever information, even ticketing information, just from either the local country or at least Europe. So the follow the sun is a bit limited to Europe, I would say, for a number of the service provider and carriers, which is a narrow follow the sun.
I know we're nearly out of time. Joe, have we got time for Clark's question, or should we? We're nearly out of time. Whether we should wrap up?
Well, we always have time for Clark.
Oh, good answer, Joe. Yeah, my real quick. I'm just curious. Those who offer both the wholesale kind of private label side as well as retail services. I know Ring does, and maybe some of the others, but. Now, how do you handle those customer channel conflicts when you are up against a deal where your retail sales guys are selling into a deal against one of your service providers on the wholesale side, and essentially no matter what, it's going to be on your platform, but sometimes your service providers are going to expect some sort of help there, I guess, to not lose to your own company there. But how do you handle conflicts like that?
Well, I know we lost Steve, but Marcel Cisco might be a good point.
Yeah, we don't have that problem, right? We don't have the retail play in place. So again, 99% of the Cisco business is going indirect, and the 1% that goes direct is either very big or very secretive, federal government, for instance. But it's not something we deal with. The only thing what we see is that a customer might have a calling service from partner A and a UCaaS service from partner B, and then the conversation becomes, what's your partner preference? But that is then something we discuss with the channel partners in play. It's not something we're gonna mingle in.
Yeah, maybe I can add. We don't have too many conflicts at although in some countries we both have a retail and an indirect business. However, we always have some Chinese walls, I would say, on how this is managed. We have a partner management teams and the retail, and also on the segmentation. We don't really have many occurrences where we target the same segments in the enterprise segment as our customers. But yeah, it has to be carefully managed. We only have these few conflicts in some countries, as we have a very, I would say, partner-first company in Europe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Patrick,
I mean,
I think.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to add, and from a Destiny perspective, I think our customer segmentation, sort of avoids a lot of this. Meaning that our direct channels oftentimes selling different than the partners, certainly through the service providers. I'm not in a commercial role, but the commercial discussions that I've been involved in, I believe there's an informal policy, even partner first, like Bertrand said. I'm not sure if they do it the same way, but in the case of channel partner, the direct channel refers to the partner, because as it was stated, it's going to come to the platform anyways. And I think in order to keep the partner channel healthy, that is a good approach as a formal or informal policy, if you will.
Got it. Okay. No, I think it helps to understand those rules of engagement there to kind of stop that before it's an issue. So thank you. Joe?
A very valid question. I think that wraps us up, Joe.
Yeah, yep. Everybody, I want to thank you. No, Patrick, I was letting you say get the last word in there, but I want to thank you all for joining us. Patrick from Cavell, thank you. Bertrand from enreach, Yves from RingCentral, Marcel from Cisco. Thank you guys very much for taking the time today. We appreciate it. In December, we're going to talk about the future role of the channel in the EU. Some channel partners say that the vendors are not in tune with them, and some vendors say that the channel partner relationships are strained. We're going to drill down on that in December. In January, we're going to talk about some of the upcoming EU regulatory announcements that are going to be kicked off in 2022. And we've added one more in November for our US focused members. We're going to talk about COVID mandates and 911 compliance, and that's going to be in November. I want to thank you all for joining us today, this evening. It's been great having you all. Be safe. We'll catch you on the next one. Have a good rest of the day, and thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Cecilia, for the organization. Bye.
Yep. Thank you.